Brexit presents us with the opportunity to take back control of our waters, but is there not a risk in creating tensions with other countries who also want access to our waters as well?
Britain's always been really badly clobbered by the common fisheries policy. There was a study that showed that although we have about 65% of North Sea waters territorially under our jurisdiction, we get a quota that is equivalent to 25% by volume or 15% by value. This is because we joined basically just before the new system came in, so we didn't benefit in the way that Iceland did when the rules changed in the early to mid-70s. Of course, we will want to recognise the historic rights of friendly countries. Right? I don't think anyone is suggesting that we will be sort of barring our waters to all other vessels. That doesn't happen anywhere in the world. If you look at any country that has sovereign control of its fisheries, right, the Falkland Islands or Iceland or Norway or New Zealand, anywhere, they all find sensible deals with their neighbours or indeed with commercial partners who are not neighbouring countries. And we will of course do that with our EU neighbours, but it'll be on the basis that it's our waters and we will decide as a sovereign country whether we have a deal on total allowable catch the way the other North Sea countries do, whether we, if you like, rent out the right to access part of our waters. It will be our decision.
The UK and the EU have both agreed that there are still differences when it comes to trade talks. How do you think that Britain can ensure we negotiate a free trade deal that regains political and economic independence?
Well, it's a negotiation, so we can't ensure it. It's up to both sides. If there is goodwill, it is very easy to see how that could happen. It has already happened between the UK and Switzerland. It took about 5 months for the UK and Switzerland to negotiate what they called a mind the gap agreement, which ensured that whatever happens with the EU, whether or not there's a deal between Britain and Brussels, the UK-Swiss relationship will carry on as before. And that covers, air travel, road travel, financial services, free trade in goods, citizenship rights, the works. So with a little bit of goodwill, that can be done very easily. And there are plenty of examples in the world of trade deals that have been done quickly, that between the US and Australia, for example. Of course, it can't happen if the EU wants to make an example of us, if the EU wants to treat us as a kind of renegade province or a breakaway colony. And if they start making demands that no other country would impose on a neighbour in the world, that, yeah, you can leave and we can have a free trade deal, but only on the basis that we continue to control your social and employment laws, and only on the basis that we have unlimited access to your fishing grounds, and only on the basis that our judges... I mean, to see how absurd those things are, imagine them the other way around. Imagine that the UK were to say, yes, we are happy to have a free trade agreement with the EU, but only on the basis that we have unlimited access to EU fishing grounds, and that British judges will continue to have a role on what happens on the continent. And by the way, we want to reopen the status of Calais, which has been occupied by the French since the reign of Mary. I mean, because this, of course, is the equivalent of putting Gibraltar and indeed the Elgin Marbles on the table. That would be a ridiculous position and would be seen to be a ridiculous position by every commentator on both sides of the channel. The really sad thing is that when the EU makes equally absurd demands, there is a chunk of the British commentariat that is now so twisted by the experience of Brexit that they are now conditioned to applaud whatever Brussels says, however self-contradictory, however unreasonable.
When looking at the US-UK trade negotiations, what do you think about the mutual interest of creating a Canada, New Zealand, UK, US trading bloc to kind of compete as one?
Well, I think it should be a bloc because that implies that it would have some kind of external customs. But I certainly am in favour of interoperable common law English-speaking countries establishing a zone of mutual recognition. I spent a lot of 2018 drafting what that would look like between Britain and America. With the Institute for Free Trade, which I was president of, I got still president. It's called the Initiative for Free Trade now. We brought together 11 think tanks, including all the big US think tanks, Heritage, Cato, AEI, and so on, and their smaller and less well-funded equivalents on this side of the Atlantic. And we had a series of meetings in Washington and in London around an oval table, like shadow trade talks. And we went through, in quite granular detail, what would the perfect US-UK trade deal look like? What would it look like in terms of pharmaceuticals, e-commerce, defense procurement, financial services, etc.? And we've come out with what we reckon is the perfect trade deal, right? If Milton Friedman on a really good day were to design a British-American trade deal, I reckon it would look a bit like this. And it's based on the very simple premise of complete reciprocity, complete mutual recognition in goods, in services, and in professional qualifications. If a drug is approved on Wall Street, that should be good. If a drug is approved by the FDA, it should be automatically good enough for us, and vice versa. If a guy can practice on Wall Street, he should be able to practice in London, and vice versa, right? So whatever is legal in one country automatically should be legal in the other. And it's important to stress we've actually got the treaty. I mean, we hired some trade lawyers to translate this into a text. So we haven't just got the proposal for what the treaty should say. We've actually got a treaty that could be actioned on the 1st of January. It was very much in the minds of all of us that this should be open to plurilateralism at the beginning. In other words, if you have a deal right from the start that says whatever is legal in Britain will be legal in the US and vice versa, very odd to see how you wouldn't extend that, for example, to Canada, which would have fairly deep FTAs with both of us. And if Canada, why not Australia? And if Australia, why not Singapore? And so on. And very quickly, you'd have a different way of doing trade, one that works on mutual recognition rather than on standardization. So instead of the old approach of saying, before we sell to each other, we have to agree on the definition of what's a car, or what's a bank, or who's qualified to sell insurance, or whatever, you basically agree to trust each other's regulators. I mean, of course, a company that does something here that is illegal would still be illegal, just as a British company mis-selling or lying to you about its content would be. But a system that allowed for full jurisdictional reciprocity would create something we've never had in trade deals before, which is, if you like, competitive deregulation, leading, I hope, to a pressure for less government and more enterprise.
As you are no longer an MEP, how do you assess your role during this transition period?
Well, I think it's quite important for people to be making the argument for free trade, and that's always been true, because free trade is a really counterintuitive concept. In 1824, Lord Macaulay, the great Whig politician and Indian administrator and poet and historian, said, "Free trade, one of the greatest blessings which a government can bestow on a people, is in almost every country unpopular." Right? True then, true now, always true. Why? Because it runs up against instincts and intuitions that are encoded deep in our genome. We're not designed for this world of superabundance and skyscrapers. And the idea that you should rely on people that you haven't met for stuff that you can't see, which is the basis of the modern economy, feels wrong. I mean, it works every time, right? It's why Singapore isn't North Korea, but it feels wrong. So the mercantilist, the anti-trader, whether it's in Washington or in Brussels or in Beijing, is able to make a series of claims, a series of assertions, all of which sound completely reasonable, but turn out to be specious, turn out to be false. When you say, we can't carry on with a trade deficit like this, or we should produce more of our own food in this country, or we can't compete with countries with slave labor, or slave wages, or we need to protect our strategic industries. All of those things sound completely commonsensical. All of them, if pursued as policies, make you poorer. Make you poorer by definition, by inexorable logic. There's no way of doing them, any of them, without suffering some cost. And I gave the examples of Singapore and North Korea because they stand at the two extremes, if you like. North Korea has elevated the principle of import substitution, of self-sufficiency, to be the supreme governing principle, juche, self-reliance. And it's now the one place on the planet where you still have man-made famines. Singapore, they produce nothing. They don't grow anything. They have to import everything they eat, all their drinking water, all their electricity. They're one of the richest places in the world. Why? Because they don't put barriers between businesses and their customers. It's counterintuitive, but come on, where would you rather live?
Is there any chance in which you plan on potentially standing for Parliament in the next election?
No. A number of the seats around me were very generous and very kind and asked me to stand in December. But I've done 21 years, I've done 5 elections, and it is so rarely given to you in this line of work to quit on your own terms. And Brexit is what I came for.
As the president for the Free Trade Initiative, how do you assist and aid the Department for International Trade?
Well, we're working I think Liz Truss is great. I think she's a brilliant trade secretary, and I'm working very closely with her and with her officials on this. Obviously, up until Brexit on the 31st of January, there was a limit as to what the government could do at all, because they weren't, they were still in the EU customs union. But I think there are things that all of us can do to help. Apart from making the case for free trade generally, we need to be out there looking for where the opportunities are. So one of the things that the IFT did is we looked at where is the biggest value added in doing quick trade deals that are feasible in the year after, or the year or two after Brexit. Obviously the US, obviously Australia and New Zealand, but what about the countries from whom we will inherit some kind of agreement through the EU? And I got some experts to look at these. I thought some of these EU trade deals are really very old, and they maybe could do with just being completely replaced by better ones. So, the EU did a trade deal with Mexico in 1994. Well, in 1994, it had nothing to say about cross-border data flows, nothing to say about e-commerce, nothing to say about, investor protection, any of the sort of modern stuff. Actually, when we did that analysis, it turned out that the place where there was the biggest avenue for mutual advantage for Britain and the other country was not Mexico, which was the first EU trade deal, but Japan, which was the most recent one. Because the EU-Japan free trade agreement is heavily weighted towards continental producer interests, particularly agriculture and some heavy industries. It has very little to offer a service-based economy like the UK, or indeed like Japan, right? So Japan and Britain on their own can do a much more ambitious deal than Japan and the EU did. And I'm delighted that Liz has decided to make Japan our early priority along with the US and the core Anglosphere countries. And in particular, I hope that Japan will solidify Britain's orientation towards the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? The TPP, I think, is a much better designed free trade agreement than the European Union, and a much faster growing area. It is a fast growing area of the world, unlike Europe. You might say that it's a bit weird geographically for Britain to be applying to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and it is true that we are not a Pacific country, except in the technical sense that we do own the Pitcairn Islands, so we do have a little. We've got one blob right in the middle of the Pacific. But, of course, geography matters less and less these days. In an age of jet travel and cheap refrigeration and the internet, what really matters is not physical proximity, but cultural proximity. And in the Pacific are countries which have very, very interoperable systems with our own. Obviously, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US if they come back in. But I'd say also, Singapore, Malaysia, arguably even the Philippines. There are lots of countries there which offer great opportunities to us.
voting in the Labour leadership contest as well as the EU negotiations have obviously coincided with one another. You know, how can the Labour Party become an effective opposition to the Tories, especially when the trade negotiations are taking place?
That's a very big question. I mean, before Jeremy Corbyn, we had a very benign left-of-centre party compared to some. I mean, that may sound like an odd thing for me to say as an ex-Conservative politician, but you don't have to look very far to see socialist parties in Europe whose origins were bloody and revolutionary, and who wanted to tear things down, strangle the last king with the bowels of the last priest, put the aristocrats in tumbrils. Labour was not like that. Labour grew out of nonconformist churches and working men's libraries and the temperance movement and brass bands, and I mean it was a movement that was about building everybody up. And what happened under Corbyn, I think, was completely outside our experience. It was this very alien Marxist view or revolutionary view that was anti-parliamentary and that believed that the end justified the means. And sure, there's always been a sort of sour sociopathic element, but it was always a fringe element, really. I really hope to God that we get back a credible and one day electable Labour Party. You need to have a decent opposition. When you don't, I mean, look what happened to Labour in Scotland when they didn't have a credible opposition. Frankly, I've seen it happen in some English counties where the Tories have an equivalent one-party rule. You have to have somebody to keep you on your toes. And my worry looking at Labour now is that you've got this hard left membership that came in with Corbyn. You've got the metropolitan identity politics obsessed parliamentary party, and neither of those even begins to speak to the mass of traditional Labour voters who of course have now become Conservative voters because that blend of patriotism and moderate market economics which previous Labour governments would have recognised has disappeared from the Labour Party.
So is there nobody at the moment standing for Labour leadership that you think could be a credible opposition?
I mean, I'd have thought probably from first principles, the guy I would, any Labour person watching this will automatically discount it and assume that I'm sort of trying to trick them or something. But the guy I'd have voted for, honestly, would have been Hilary Benn. I think he was probably the most reasonable. Of the ones who are still running, Lisa Nandy seems to be the most, at least in the zone of that traditional Labour Party, and for that reason I suspect she hasn't got a hope.
And finally, questions have also been raised as to whether or not Brexit should be delayed because of coronavirus, with the former Chancellor Philip Hannan saying that it's got the potential to push Britain into a recession. What are your thoughts on this?
If the coronavirus really is this, catastrophic plague, then of course we're going to be pushed into a recession, as will the whole world, and the question of being in or out of the EU won't arise. I think that is very unlikely. There's nothing that I've seen so far that makes me think that this cannot be managed. It's a question of ensuring that the contagion is not bunched up in a way that overwhelms our resources, right? And it's not rocket science. If people wash their hands, don't touch their face, and stay home as soon as they feel they've got a cold, we can do this, right? I don't think we're heading for some kind of 28 days later sort of zombie apocalypse. If anything, you could argue that it makes the case for it makes an equally strong case for the EU to come to the table and do the deal quickly, rather than risking the standoff, which it has been risking up until now, by making demands that it knows to be unreasonable. But to be honest, I think either way, the two issues are unlikely to interlock. I don't think there's any hope from the EU's point of view, any danger from our point of view of a delay. That's going to happen. Brexit is going to happen on time, whatever the condition.